What happened when the ER refused to help my daughter because of her race? I carried my daughter Amara through the automatic doors of St. Luke's Memorial Hospital emergency room at 8:43 on a Friday night. She was 11 years old, burning with fever, barely conscious, her breathing rapid and shallow. Her brown skin was flushed with heat and her lips had started turning pale, signs of severe dehydration from 3 days of vomiting and diarrhea that had suddenly worsened in the past hour. I'd called her pediatrician's emergency line and been told to get her to the ER immediately, that she might need IV fluids and antibiotics if this was a serious infection. The waiting room was moderately full, maybe 15 people in various states of distress. I went straight to the triage window where a nurse sat behind plexiglass doing paperwork. "Please, my daughter needs help. She's been sick for days and now she can barely stay awake. Her doctor said to bring her in immediately." The nurse, whose name tag read L. Buckley, looked up slowly and assessed Amara with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What's the chief complaint?" Her tone was flat, bureaucratic. "Severe vomiting, diarrhea, high fever, dehydration. She needs to be seen right away." I could hear the desperation in my voice. Nurse Buckley made a note on her computer. "Insurance card and ID, please." I fumbled in my purse while holding Amara with one arm, pulled out my insurance card and driver's license, and slid them under the glass. Buckley scanned them without urgency, typed information into her system, then handed them back. "Take a seat in the waiting area. Someone will call you when a room is available." I stared at her. "You don't understand. My daughter can barely breathe properly. Her lips are turning pale. This is an emergency." Buckley's expression didn't change. "Everyone here thinks they're an emergency. We have to follow triage protocols. She's conscious and breathing, so she'll be assessed in order of arrival. Take a seat." Her dismissal was absolute, and I felt rage and fear warring in my chest. I looked around the waiting room at the other patients. An older white man with a cast on his arm reading a magazine. A white woman holding an ice pack to her ankle. A Hispanic couple with a crying toddler who seemed to have a cough. None of them looked as sick as Amara, whose head was now lolling against my shoulder, her body limp and burning. I went back to the window. "Please look at her. She's not conscious. This is serious." Buckley sighed with obvious irritation. "Ma'am, I've triaged her. She doesn't meet criteria for immediate intervention. Now please take a seat or you'll be asked to leave." The threat was clear. I carried Amara to a chair and sat down, pulling her onto my lap. Her breathing was getting worse, more labored, and when I touched her forehead, the heat radiating from her skin was terrifying. I checked her pulse on her wrist and it was racing, weak and thready. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was seriously wrong, that we didn't have time to wait. 45 minutes passed. I watched other patients get called back. The man with the cast, the woman with the ankle injury, a teenage boy who'd walked in after us complaining of stomach pain. All of them white. All of them called before my daughter, who was now so unresponsive, I had to keep checking to make sure she was still breathing. I went back to the triage window 3 times. Each time Buckley told me to be patient, that they were working as fast as they could, that my daughter would be seen when a room opened up. On the 3rd attempt, she added, "Maybe if you'd brought her in sooner instead of waiting, she wouldn't be so sick now." We see a lot of parents who neglect their kids and then expect us to fix everything immediately. The accusation was delivered in that same flat tone, but the implication was clear. She was suggesting I'd been negligent, that this was my fault. I wanted to scream that I'd brought Amara to her pediatrician twice this week, that I'd been following medical advice, that I'd come to the ER the moment things had gotten worse. But I was afraid that making a scene would only delay treatment further or get us thrown out entirely. So I went back to my seat and held my daughter and prayed. At the 90-minute mark, Amara's breathing changed. It became shallow and rapid, her chest rising and falling in quick, ineffective gasps. Her lips had gone from pale to slightly blue and her skin felt clammy despite the fever. I knew these were signs of respiratory distress, potentially shock. I'd taken CPR training when Amara was born and recognized the symptoms. I stood up, carried her to the triage window, and this time I didn't ask. I demanded. "My daughter is going into shock. Her breathing is failing. If you don't get her to a doctor right now, she could die. I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you this is a medical emergency, and if you continue to refuse treatment, I'm calling 911 and filing a complaint with the state health department." Buckley's face hardened. "Are you threatening me?" Her voice had risen enough that other people in the waiting room were now watching us. "I'm telling you my daughter is dying and you're letting it happen. Get a doctor, now." Buckley stood up and disappeared through a door behind the triage desk. She returned 2 minutes later with a doctor in scrubs whose name tag identified him as Dr. Philip Sutherland. He was in his 50s, white with gray hair and an expression of barely concealed annoyance. He looked at me, then at Amara, and his assessment lasted maybe 5 seconds. "What seems to be the problem?" His tone suggested this was a waste of his time. "My daughter has been vomiting and having diarrhea for 3 days. Tonight she got much worse. She's barely conscious. Her breathing is failing. She's showing signs of shock. She needs immediate intervention." Dr. Sutherland crossed his arms. "Has she been taking any fluids at home?" I nodded frantically. "Yes, I've been giving her water and electrolyte drinks, but she can't keep anything down. That's why I brought her here. She needs IV fluids and she needs to be examined for infection." Dr. Sutherland made a show of looking at his watch. Well, I'm sure you understand we're very busy tonight. Your daughter doesn't appear to be in immediate distress. Children often look worse than they are when they have stomach bugs. She probably just needs rest and continued oral hydration. I'd recommend taking her home, keeping her comfortable, and following up with her regular doctor in the morning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She's not keeping anything down. Her lips are blue. She's barely breathing. She needs help now, not tomorrow. Dr. Sutherland's expression shifted into something colder. Ma'am, I'm a physician with 25 years of experience. I can assess whether a child is in genuine medical distress. Your daughter is fine. She has a stomach virus. You're being overly dramatic and you're taking up resources that could go to patients who actually need emergency care. Now I suggest you take her home before I have security escort you out. The dismissal was complete and the threat was explicit. I looked at his face and saw something I'd seen before in my life as a black woman in America. That particular kind of dismissal that said my concerns didn't matter. My judgment wasn't valid. My fear for my child's life was just hysteria to be managed. I thought about arguing further, but Amara made a sound, a weak moan, and I felt her body go more limp in my arms. I made a split-second decision. I walked past Dr. Sutherland toward the doors that led back to the treatment area. He grabbed my arm. You can't go back there. That's a restricted area. I pulled free. Then admit my daughter and treat her. She's dying and you're refusing to help. What happened next happened fast. Dr. Sutherland called for security. 2 large men in uniforms appeared and positioned themselves between me and the treatment area doors. One of them, whose name tag read J. Morrison, told me I needed to leave the premises immediately or I'd be arrested for trespassing. I stood there holding my dying daughter while a doctor refused to treat her, and security threatened to arrest me. The helplessness and rage were suffocating. That's when a nurse appeared from the treatment area. She was South Asian, maybe in her 30s, wearing purple scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck. Her name tag identified her as Priya Bakshi, RN. She looked at Amara, looked at me, and then looked at Dr. Sutherland with an expression of shock. Dr. Sutherland, this child is clearly in distress. Look at her respiratory rate, her color, her level of consciousness. She needs to be in a treatment room right now. Dr. Sutherland's face flushed. Nurse Bakshi, I've already assessed this patient and determined she doesn't meet criteria for emergency intervention. The mother is being difficult and needs to be removed from the premises. Nurse Bakshi ignored him and addressed the security guards directly. This child is in respiratory distress and possible septic shock. If you remove her from this hospital without treatment, you'll be complicit in her death. I'm documenting that I advocated for immediate intervention and was overruled by Dr. Sutherland. The specificity of her statement, the legal language, the clear documentation of responsibility shifted something in the room. The security guards looked at each other uncertainly. Nurse Bakshi turned to me. Come with me. I'm taking her back to a treatment room. Dr. Sutherland stepped in front of her. You don't have authorization to admit patients. I'm the attending physician and I've made my assessment. If you countermand my orders, you'll face disciplinary action. Nurse Bakshi met his eyes. And if this child dies because you refuse to treat her, you'll face malpractice charges and potentially criminal negligence charges. I've been a nurse for 12 years. I know what medical emergency looks like. This is one. So either you admit her right now and start treatment, or I'm calling an ambulance to transfer her to County General and filing an incident report with the medical board detailing everything that happened here tonight. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds before Dr. Sutherland made a disgusted sound and waved his hand dismissively. Fine, put her in Bay 3. But this is a waste of resources and I'm documenting the mother's disruptive behavior. Nurse Bakshi took Amara from my arms and carried her quickly through the doors. I followed, ignoring Dr. Sutherland's glare. Bay 3 was a small treatment room with a bed, monitors, and medical equipment. Nurse Bakshi laid Amara on the bed and immediately started hooking her up to monitors. Pulse oximeter on her finger, blood pressure cuff on her arm, leads on her chest for heart monitoring. The machine started beeping immediately, displaying numbers that even I could tell were bad. Oxygen saturation at 89% when it should be above 95. Heart rate at 156 beats per minute when normal for her age was 70 to 110. Blood pressure at 78/45, dangerously low. Nurse Bakshi called out to someone in the hallway. I need Dr. Okonkwo in Bay 3 immediately. Pediatric patient in suspected septic shock. Another doctor appeared within seconds, a black woman in her 40s wearing an emergency medicine badge that identified her as Dr. Chimamanda Okonkwo. She took one look at the monitors and started barking orders. Get me 2 large bore IVs, start normal saline wide open, draw blood for CBC, CMP, blood cultures, and lactate. I need chest x-ray and urinalysis. Call pediatrics for consult. This kid is crashing. Nurses and techs swarmed the room, moving with practiced efficiency. Someone started an IV in Amara's arm while someone else drew blood. Dr. Okonkwo examined Amara quickly but thoroughly, checking her lungs, her abdomen, her skin, her level of responsiveness. How long has she been sick? Dr. Okonkwo asked me while continuing her examination. I explained everything. 3 days of vomiting and diarrhea, 2 visits to the pediatrician, sudden worsening tonight, the hour and a half in the waiting room, Dr. Sutherland's refusal to treat her. Dr. Okonkwo's jaw tightened as I spoke, but she stayed focused on Amara. Your daughter has severe sepsis, possibly septic shock. Looks like it started as gastroenteritis but has progressed to systemic infection. Her blood pressure is dangerously low and she's in the early stages of organ failure. We're going to stabilize her here and then transfer her to pediatric ICU. The next few hours are critical. The words hit me with physical force. Organ failure, ICU, critical. My baby was dying and we'd lost 90 minutes in a waiting room because a doctor had decided she wasn't sick enough to deserve treatment. Dr. Okonkwo must have seen something in my face because she gripped my shoulder. We've got her now. The IV fluids will help bring her blood pressure up and we're starting broad-spectrum antibiotics. She's young and strong. We caught it in time. Her confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if Nurse Bakshi hadn't intervened. If I'd taken Dr. Sutherland's advice and gone home, Amara would be dead by morning. The next 2 hours were a blur of medical procedures, tests, medications being pushed through IVs, and monitors being adjusted. Dr. Okonkwo stayed in the room almost the entire time, supervising every intervention, checking Amara's responses, adjusting treatment protocols. Nurse Bakshi stayed too, beyond her shift end, refusing to leave until Amara was stabilized. By 11:30, Amara's blood pressure had improved to 95/58, still low but moving in the right direction. Her oxygen saturation was back up to 94%. She was still unconscious, but her breathing had stabilized. The blood cultures had been sent to the lab and preliminary results suggested E. coli sepsis, a severe bacterial infection that had entered her bloodstream. Dr. Okonkwo explained that this sometimes happened with gastroenteritis, especially in children, when bacteria from the intestinal infection crossed into the bloodstream. It was treatable with the right antibiotics but could be fatal without intervention. Amara was transferred to pediatric ICU at midnight. I rode with her in the elevator, holding her hand while ICU nurses took over her care. Dr. Okonkwo came with us and gave a detailed handoff to the ICU attending, including everything about the delayed treatment and the circumstances in the ER. The ICU doctor, Dr. James Whitfield, listened with a grave expression and assured me they'd take excellent care of her. Once Amara was settled in ICU with round-the-clock monitoring, Dr. Okonkwo pulled me aside to a small consultation room. She closed the door and sat down across from me. I need to ask you some questions about what happened in the ER tonight, and I need you to be as specific as possible because I'm going to be filing an incident report. I told her everything. The triage nurse's dismissive attitude, the 90-minute wait while white patients with less serious conditions were seen first, the accusations of negligence, Dr. Sutherland's refusal to examine Amara properly despite clear signs of distress, the threat to have me removed by security, Nurse Bakshi's intervention. Dr. Okonkwo took notes on a tablet, stopping me occasionally to ask for exact times and specific quotes. When I finished, she sat back and rubbed her eyes. I'm sorry you and your daughter went through that. What Dr. Sutherland did was medically negligent at best and potentially criminally negligent at worst. Your daughter presented with textbook signs of septic shock and he dismissed her without proper examination or treatment. That's a serious violation of medical standards and potentially of civil rights laws. I asked what she meant by civil rights laws. Dr. Okonkwo chose her words carefully. I've been working in emergency medicine for 15 years. I've seen patterns of how patients of different races are treated differently in ERs. Black and brown patients, especially children, are more likely to have their pain dismissed, their symptoms minimized, and their need for intervention questioned. Studies have documented this extensively. It's called racial bias in healthcare, and it kills people. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something crack open in my chest. I'd experienced racism my entire life, but I'd somehow convinced myself that doctors, people who took oaths to help everyone regardless of race, would be different when my child's life was on the line. Dr. Okonkwo continued. I'm filing this incident report with hospital administration and with the state medical board. I'm going to recommend a full investigation into Dr. Sutherland's treatment decisions tonight and into the triage protocols that allowed your daughter to wait 90 minutes despite obvious signs of medical emergency. Nurse Bakshi will be filing her own report. And I'd strongly recommend you consult with an attorney who specializes in medical malpractice and civil rights cases because what happened tonight was wrong on multiple levels. She gave me her business card and wrote several phone numbers on the back. These are attorneys I know who've handled cases involving racial bias in medical treatment. Call them tomorrow. And here's my direct number if you need anything or if anyone from the hospital tries to pressure you not to pursue this. I took the card with shaking hands and thanked her for saving Amara's life. Dr. Okonkwo shook her head. Nurse Bakshi saved your daughter's life by refusing to follow an unethical order. I just did what any competent emergency physician would do. The fact that it took 90 minutes and a nurse risking her job for your daughter to receive basic medical care is the problem we need to fix. I spent that night in a chair next to Amara's ICU bed watching monitors and praying. She remained unconscious through the night, but her vital signs continued stabilizing. The antibiotics were working and her body was starting to fight back against the infection. By morning, her blood pressure was nearly normal and her oxygen levels were good. The ICU nurses told me these were excellent signs. Amara finally woke up around 8:30 Saturday morning, confused and scared but alive. She didn't remember anything from the previous night, which was probably a blessing. I held her hand and told her she'd been very sick, but the doctors had made her better and she just needed to rest now. She was too weak to talk much, but she squeezed my hand and that was enough. Around 10 o'clock, a woman in a business suit appeared at the ICU door and introduced herself as Leslie Thornton, Director of Patient Relations for St. Luke's Memorial Hospital. She asked if she could speak with me privately, and I reluctantly left Amara with the nurses to follow Thornton to another consultation room. Thornton was in her 50s, white, with careful makeup and a practiced sympathetic expression that immediately put me on guard. Miss Garrett, first let me say how relieved we are that your daughter is recovering. We understand there were some concerns about the treatment process last night, and I wanted to address those directly. Her phrasing, concerns about the treatment process, was so sanitized it bordered on insulting. My daughter nearly died because your ER doctor refused to treat her for 90 minutes despite obvious signs of sepsis. That's not a concern. That's negligence. Thornton's expression didn't change. I understand you're upset, and I want to assure you we're taking this matter very seriously. Dr. Sutherland has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into the incident. We've also initiated a review of our triage protocols. However, I want to caution you that these situations are often more complex than they appear. Dr. Sutherland is an experienced physician who is managing multiple patients in a busy ER. Sometimes in the chaos of emergency medicine, assessments can be challenging. I stared at her. Are you seriously trying to excuse what he did? Thornton held up her hands in a placating gesture. I'm not excusing anything. I'm simply saying that we need to conduct a thorough investigation before drawing conclusions. In the meantime, I wanted to discuss how the hospital can support you and Amara during her recovery. We're prepared to cover all medical costs related to this hospitalization and to provide any additional resources you might need. The offer was delivered smoothly, professionally, but I understood what was really happening. This was damage control. They were trying to buy my silence before I could pursue legal action. I thought about Dr. Okonkwo's advice and the attorney names on her business card. I appreciate that you're covering the medical costs, but what I really want is accountability. I want to know why a doctor looked at my dying daughter and decided she didn't deserve treatment. I want to know if race played a role in that decision, and I want to make sure this never happens to another family. Thornton's practiced sympathy cracked slightly. Miss Garrett, I understand you're looking for answers, but I need to be clear that making unfounded accusations about racial bias could have serious legal implications. Unless you have specific evidence that race was a factor in Dr. Sutherland's medical decisions, I'd caution you against making such claims publicly. The threat was implicit but clear. They were worried about exactly that, a racial discrimination lawsuit, and they were trying to preemptively shut down that avenue. Dr. Okonkwo told me about studies showing racial bias in emergency treatment. She told me that Black children are more likely to have their pain and symptoms dismissed. She told me this fits a pattern. Is she lying? Thornton's face went rigid. Dr. Okonkwo provided excellent medical care to your daughter, but her opinions about systemic issues don't reflect hospital policy or established facts about this specific incident. I would ask that you focus on what actually happened rather than broader narratives that may not apply here. She was trying to separate the individual incident from the systemic pattern, to make it about one doctor's mistake rather than institutional racism. But I'd spent my whole life watching how systems protected themselves by claiming each instance of discrimination was just an isolated incident, never part of a larger problem. I'm going to be consulting with an attorney, I said. And I'm going to be filing a complaint with the state medical board and any other agency that oversees hospital conduct. What happened to my daughter was wrong and someone needs to be held accountable. Thornton stood up, her professional mask firmly back in place. That's certainly your right, Miss Garrett. Just understand that legal action can be stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. It might be in everyone's best interest to resolve this matter privately. The hospital is prepared to discuss a reasonable settlement that addresses your concerns without the burden of litigation. I stood up too. My daughter almost died because a doctor decided she wasn't worth treating. There's no settlement amount that makes that okay. I want justice, not money. After Thornton left, I called the first attorney on Dr. Okonkwo's list. His name was Marcus Williams. Damn, I can't use Marcus. Let me call him Isaiah Williams, a civil rights attorney who specialized in medical discrimination cases. His assistant scheduled an appointment for Monday morning and took detailed notes about what had happened. I spent the rest of Saturday with Amara, watching her slowly regain strength. By Sunday, she was sitting up in bed, eating small amounts of soft food, and asking when she could go home. The ICU doctors said she'd need at least another 3 or 4 days of IV antibiotics to completely clear the infection, but her prognosis was excellent. Dr. Okonkwo stopped by Sunday afternoon to check on Amara. She brought a stuffed unicorn from the hospital gift shop, and Amara's face lit up. After chatting with Amara for a few minutes, Dr. Okonkwo pulled me into the hallway. I filed my incident report Friday night. Nurse Bakshi filed hers Saturday morning. The hospital administration contacted me and strongly suggested I might be overreacting and should consider withdrawing or amending my report. I declined. I also want you to know that I've documented similar patterns with Dr. Sutherland's treatment decisions over the past 2 years. 3 other cases where Black or Hispanic patients presenting with serious conditions were dismissed or undertreated, while white patients with less severe issues were prioritized. I never had enough evidence to prove discrimination definitively, but the pattern is there. I asked if she'd be willing to share that documentation with my attorney. Dr. Okonkwo nodded. Absolutely. In fact, I've already contacted 2 of the other families to let them know about your case. One of them is considering joining any legal action you pursue. The more voices we have, the harder it is for the hospital to claim these are isolated incidents. Monday morning, I met with Isaiah Williams at his downtown office. He was in his late 40s, black, with a calm intensity that inspired confidence. He listened to my account without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. This is a strong case for both medical malpractice and civil rights violations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits race-based discrimination in facilities receiving federal funding. St. Luke's receives Medicare and Medicaid funding, so they're covered. The challenge is always proving that race was a motivating factor in treatment decisions. But you have several things working in your favor. Documented delay in treatment while less serious white patients were seen first, dismissive language from the triage nurse suggesting negligence on your part, Dr. Sutherland's refusal to properly examine your daughter despite obvious distress, and most importantly, testimony from medical professionals documenting both the severity of Amara's condition and the pattern of similar incidents. Isaiah explained that we had multiple options. We could file a medical malpractice lawsuit against Dr. Sutherland and the hospital, seeking compensation for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and the trauma of inadequate care. We could file a civil rights complaint with the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights, which could investigate and potentially impose sanctions on the hospital. We could file a complaint with the state medical board seeking disciplinary action against Dr. Sutherland's license. Or we could do all 3 simultaneously. What I recommend, Isaiah said, is that we start with the federal civil rights complaint and the medical board complaint. Those investigations will generate evidence and documentation that will strengthen any subsequent malpractice lawsuit. Federal investigations also put public pressure on institutions in ways that private lawsuits don't. The hospital will know this isn't just about one family wanting money. It's about systemic accountability. I agreed to his strategy and spent the next 2 hours providing detailed statements and signing authorization forms. Isaiah said he'd file the complaints by end of business Monday and that the hospital would receive notice within a few days. He also warned me that things would get ugly. Institutions don't change voluntarily. They fight. The hospital will hire investigators to look into your background, looking for anything they can use to discredit you. They'll claim you're exaggerating or misremembering. They'll argue that Dr. Sutherland's decisions were based on legitimate medical judgment, not race. They'll pressure Dr. Okonkwo and Nurse Bakshi to recant or soften their statements. You need to be prepared for a long, difficult fight. Amara was discharged from ICU on Thursday, 6 days after we'd arrived at the ER. She was weak but recovering and would need follow-up care with her pediatrician and an infectious disease specialist. The final hospital bill, which St. Luke's had agreed to cover, was over $85,000. The ICU stay alone had been $12,000 per day. When I saw those numbers, I understood why many families couldn't pursue legal action even when they'd been wronged. The medical system could bankrupt you, and then you were too financially devastated to fight back. Isaiah had warned me that the hospital's offer to cover costs was strategic. It created an appearance of good faith while actually binding me to them through financial benefit. If I sued, they'd argue I'd already been compensated. But Isaiah had documented that their coverage of costs wasn't a settlement or admission of liability, just fulfillment of their basic obligation to provide emergency medical care they'd initially refused. The Office for Civil Rights complaint was filed Monday afternoon. The State Medical Board complaint was filed on Wednesday. By Friday, St. Luke's Memorial Hospital had received notice of both investigations. Isaiah called me that evening to let me know the hospital's attorneys had already contacted him, requesting a meeting to discuss mutually agreeable resolution. He'd declined, explaining that we weren't interested in private settlements until the investigations were complete. The investigations took months. The OCR sent investigators to St. Luke's in September, 3 months after Amara's hospitalization. They reviewed medical records, interviewed staff, examined triage logs, and analyzed treatment patterns. They requested demographic data on all ER patients over the previous 2 years, including race, presenting symptoms, wait times, and treatment outcomes. The medical board conducted its own investigation, interviewing Dr. Sutherland, reviewing his patient care history, and examining his medical decision-making process on the night Amara had been denied treatment. During this time, Dr. Okonkwo and Nurse Bakshi both faced retaliation. Dr. Okonkwo was suddenly subjected to increased scrutiny of her medical decisions, with hospital administrators questioning her judgment on cases that had previously been uncontroversial. Her schedule was changed repeatedly, making it difficult for her to maintain consistent patient care. Nurse Bakshi was written up for minor infractions that had previously been ignored, and her performance reviews suddenly became critical after years of exemplary ratings. Both filed their own retaliation complaints with OCR, which expanded the federal investigation. Isaiah explained that retaliation against whistleblowers was often the evidence that proved institutional knowledge and intent. If the hospital was willing to punish staff for reporting discrimination, it suggested they knew discrimination was occurring and wanted to suppress information about it. In October, another family came forward. The Johnsons, a black family whose 16-year-old son had been treated at St. Luke's ER in March with a broken arm from a skateboarding accident. They'd waited 4 hours for treatment while multiple white patients with less urgent conditions had been seen first. When their son had finally been treated, he'd received inadequate pain medication and minimal explanation of aftercare. They'd filed a complaint with the hospital at the time but had been dismissed with the same explanations about busy ERs and complex triage decisions. Now, learning about Amara's case and Dr. Okonkwo's documentation of patterns, they contacted Isaiah about joining the civil rights complaint. Then a Hispanic family, the Garcias, came forward with a similar story about their daughter who'd been denied proper treatment for an asthma attack. The pattern was becoming undeniable. In November, the OCR released preliminary findings. Their investigation had identified statistically significant disparities in ER treatment at St. Luke's Memorial Hospital. Black and Hispanic patients waited an average of 37 minutes longer than white patients with similar conditions. Pain medication was administered to black patients at significantly lower rates than white patients presenting with identical injuries. Triage assessments for black patients were more likely to underestimate severity compared to actual diagnoses. And most damningly, they'd identified 14 cases over 2 years where patients of color had experienced delayed treatment resulting in worsened medical outcomes, including 3 cases of preventable complications. The report didn't use Dr. Sutherland's name specifically, but it noted that one ER physician was responsible for a disproportionate number of the problematic treatment decisions. The medical board's investigation was released in December. They found that Dr. Sutherland had violated standards of care in Amara's case by failing to properly assess a patient showing obvious signs of medical emergency. They also noted a pattern of dismissed complaints from patients of color against Dr. Sutherland over his 25-year career, complaints that had been individually dismissed but collectively suggested bias in his treatment decisions. The board imposed a 6-month suspension of his medical license, required completion of cultural competency training and implicit bias education before reinstatement, and placed him on probationary status for 2 years following reinstatement. It wasn't enough. He should have lost his license entirely. But Isaiah explained that medical boards rarely revoked licenses except for egregious cases, and proving that bias rose to the level of incompetence requiring permanent license revocation was extremely difficult. At least the suspension and the public record of the investigation would make it harder for Dr. Sutherland to harm other patients. St. Luke's Memorial Hospital faced more serious consequences. The OCR issued a determination letter in January, finding that the hospital had violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act through discriminatory treatment patterns in their emergency department. The hospital was required to implement a comprehensive remediation plan, including mandatory implicit bias training for all clinical and support staff, revision of triage protocols with specific guidelines for assessing patients of color, appointment of a civil rights compliance officer, implementation of regular audits of treatment patterns by demographic categories, and establishment of an independent patient advocacy system for reporting discrimination concerns. The hospital was also fined $500,000 and placed under federal monitoring for 3 years. Any future violations would result in loss of federal funding, which would effectively shut down the hospital. Leslie Thornton, the patient relations director, was quietly terminated. Nurse Buckley, the triage nurse, was transferred to a non-patient-facing role. The hospital issued a public apology acknowledging that their systems had failed to provide equitable care and committed to becoming a leader in eliminating healthcare disparities. The apology was careful not to admit specific acts of discrimination, which would have created additional legal liability, but it was more than most institutions offered. Isaiah filed the malpractice lawsuit in February, representing not just our family, but the Johnsons and Garcias as well. The lawsuit alleged institutional negligence, medical malpractice, and civil rights violations. We weren't seeking just compensation but systemic changes beyond what the OCR had mandated. The hospital fought for 6 months. Their attorneys argued that the OCR findings didn't prove discrimination in any specific case, just statistical disparities that could have multiple explanations. They claimed Dr. Sutherland's treatment decisions had been based on legitimate medical judgment, not racial bias. They tried to discredit Dr. Okonkwo and Nurse Bakshi as disgruntled employees with axes to grind. They hired expert witnesses who testified that emergency medicine was inherently chaotic and that split-second triage decisions couldn't be second-guessed with the benefit of hindsight. But they couldn't explain away the documented patterns. They couldn't explain why Amara had waited 90 minutes with clear signs of septic shock, while less urgent white patients were treated first. They couldn't explain the statistical disparities in pain medication administration and wait times. They couldn't explain why 14 patients of color had experienced preventable complications while receiving care from their ER. In August, the hospital settled. The terms included $2.3 million divided among the 3 families, establishment of a healthcare equity fund to provide free medical care to underserved community members, funding for a 5-year independent study of treatment outcomes by race at St. Luke's, and implementation of additional reforms beyond what OCR had mandated, including demographic diversity requirements for hiring ER physicians and administrators. The settlement was structured to create accountability and systemic change, not just provide financial compensation. Dr. Sutherland never returned to St. Luke's after his suspension. He quietly relocated to a rural practice in another state where the medical board investigation wasn't well known. Dr. Okonkwo and Nurse Bakshi both received settlements for the retaliation they'd experienced and formal apologies from hospital administration. Dr. Okonkwo was promoted to Emergency Department Medical Director with explicit authority to revise treatment protocols and investigate discrimination complaints. Nurse Bakshi became the hospital's first patient advocacy coordinator, a new position created to give patients and staff a direct channel for reporting concerns about inequitable care. Both women said they'd stayed at St. Luke's because they believed they could create change from within, but only because the external pressure from lawsuits and federal investigations had forced the institution to allow that change. Amara recovered fully from her sepsis. The infection left no permanent damage, and within a few months she was back to her normal, energetic self. But she remembered being sick, remembered the hospital, remembered the fear. When I tried to explain what had happened in age-appropriate terms, she asked a question that broke my heart. Did the doctor not help me because I'm black? I could have lied. I could have told her it was complicated or that we couldn't know for sure, but she deserved the truth. Yes, baby. I think that's part of why he didn't help you right away. Some people treat black people differently, even doctors who are supposed to help everyone. But other doctors, like Dr. Okonkwo, fought to make sure you got better. And now we're fighting to make sure it doesn't happen to other kids. 3 years after that terrible night in the ER, St. Luke's Memorial Hospital's treatment disparities have measurably improved. The independent audits show that wait times for patients of color have decreased by 41%. Pain medication administration rates are now statistically equivalent across demographic groups. The number of preventable complications in patients of color has dropped to levels comparable with white patients. The mandatory implicit bias training has become a model that other hospitals are adopting. Dr. Okonkwo says there's still work to do, but that the institutional culture has shifted in meaningful ways. She also says that none of it would have happened without families like ours refusing to accept discrimination and demanding accountability. Isaiah Williams used the case as a foundation for broader civil rights work in healthcare. He's now representing 17 families across the state in similar cases against hospitals and medical practices. The patterns of racial bias in healthcare are undeniable, documented in countless studies, but individual cases with clear evidence and persistent families willing to fight are what force institutions to change. The settlement money we received was substantial, but Amara's college fund now has resources I never could have provided otherwise. More importantly, we used part of the settlement to establish a medical advocacy nonprofit that helps families of color navigate healthcare discrimination and connect with attorneys who can hold institutions accountable. On the 4th anniversary of Amara's hospitalization, we attended a community health fair organized by St. Luke's as part of their equity initiatives. Dr. Okonkwo was there, as was Nurse Bakshi, both speaking on panels about identifying and addressing bias in medical treatment. Amara, now 15, spoke briefly about her experience and about the importance of patients and families speaking up when they receive inadequate care. She was poised and articulate, and when she finished, several people came up to thank her for her courage. One woman, a young black mother with a baby in her arms, told Amara that she'd heard about our case, and it had given her the confidence to report discriminatory treatment she'd received during her pregnancy. That report had led to changes in the hospital's obstetrics practices. She said our fight had made it possible for her to advocate for herself and her child. That's what justice looks like. Not just individual compensation or punitive measures against specific bad actors, but systemic changes that protect others. Not just accountability for past harm, but prevention of future harm. Amara is alive because Nurse Bakshi refused to follow an unethical order, and because Dr. Okonkwo provided excellent emergency care. But she almost died because a doctor looked at a black child in obvious medical distress and decided she wasn't worth treating. Both truths exist simultaneously, and confronting the second truth is the only way to ensure the first truth happens consistently for everyone. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.